this evening we are welcoming Leilani Steele. Stell, thank you, not too easy. Yeah, thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing your story and being with us here in Northern California. And with that, I'm just going to hand it right over to you. It looks like you are a teacher, professor of biology at Redlands College in Southern California, and also studied with our own Andrew Trite, who is up at UBC studying. We were talking a little bit about stellar sea lions being near and dear to our hearts. Welcome, Leilani. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I wish I could be there in person. I've actually been up to the Fort Bragg area, but I didn't know about the program or the Ocean Science Center. So hopefully I can come and visit in person soon.
Please do reach out to us. We will be happy to host you. And yeah, please do reach out.
Sounds good.
We'll come through town. So.
Okay, are you able to see my screen now?
We see that. Right. Beautiful.
Yes, and please feel free to put questions in the chat or even interrupt. I'm happy to take questions at any point. So, as mentioned, I am a professor at the University of Redlands, and in fact, I noticed one of my former students in the audience. And I work with a great dedicated group of students who help to collect data for a long-term monitoring project so that we can understand more about marine mammals within the Southern California Bight. And we have a lot of different projects going on. I'm just touching on a few examples, specifically some of the ones that use more modern technology, because that seemed to be an area of interest. But we really do kind of a lot of different things, so please feel free to ask about other topics as well. And I like this quote as a starter because I'm assuming, like many of you, I've always been fascinated by the oceans and especially marine mammals. So I want to start by just giving you a little bit of background about my process and how I got to do this project and work. So I really have to give my father credit. He decided to move to Hawaii when he was a teenager who wasn't very directed and wanted to become a surf bum. Seems like a good goal. But he eventually did go to school, became an engineer, and then he and my mom moved back to Hawaii, which is where I was born. And we lived on a boat when I was a baby, and I was even growing up, I grew up in California, but spent the whole time going to tide pools, sailing, snorkeling, got scuba dive certified as soon as I could. And I think that environment of being exposed to all of that life when I was young really led to my passion for marine animals. So in terms of education, I was very focused, went to UC Santa Cruz for my undergraduate to study marine biology. And there I got involved in a project focused on seals and sea lions, did one project at Point Lobos on harbor seal pup diving behavior and physiology. And then I went on to my master's at University of British Columbia, where I worked with Dr. Bob Blake and Dr. Andrew Trite. There, my research was actually on stellar sea lions and looking at the biomechanics of their swimming. And from there, I went to UCLA and focused on gray whale foraging ecology. This picture, you might guess, is not from Los Angeles, but actually from Baja. And my research was actually up in British Columbia, but not many places where you can touch a whale besides Baja. So fortunately, my husband is not a scientist, which I think is actually kind of nice because we come at things from different perspectives, but he's an artist and a photographer. So almost the majority of the photos you'll see in this presentation are thanks to my husband, Shane Keena, and he is a great asset and really helps out a lot on the research. And we have a daughter who I can't believe is now as tall as I am, and we have dragged her along on all of our adventures. That photo was taken in Palau just a couple weeks ago, where we take students to learn about marine sustainability in Palau. So pretty much what we do in our professional life is the same as what we do for fun, and kind of our all-encompassing passion is the oceans and ocean conservation. So now I probably don't have to convince you that marine mammals are important, but I like this video that really illustrates the role of marine mammals in the ecosystem. And this one has volume, so please let me know if you cannot hear it.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. We all know that whales eat fish and krill, and some people, certain politicians in Japan for instance, have argued that killing whales is good for human beings, as it boosts the food available for us to eat. And so you would think. But as the great whales declined, so did the numbers of fish and krill. It seems counterintuitive. Surely their numbers would rise as their major predators disappeared. But it now turns out that whales not only eat these animals, they also keep them alive. In fact, they help to sustain the entire living system of the ocean. Whales feed at depth in waters that are often pitch dark, and then they return to the surface, to the photic zone, where there's enough light for photosynthesis to happen. There they release what biologists call fecal plumes, vast outpourings of poo, punamis. These plumes are rich in iron and nitrogen, nutrients which are often very scarce in the surface waters. And these nutrients fertilize the plant plankton that lives in the only place where plants can survive, the photic zone. Fertilizing the surface waters isn't the only thing the whales do. By plunging up and down through the water column, they also keep kicking the plankton back up into the photic zone, giving it more time to reproduce before it sinks into the abyss. Even today, though whale populations have been greatly reduced, the vertical mixing of water caused by movements of animals up and down through the column of the oceans is astonishingly roughly the same as the amount of mixing caused by all the world's wind and waves and tides. More plant plankton means more animal plankton, on which the larger creatures then feed. In other words, more whales means more fish and krill. But the story doesn't end here, because plant plankton not only feeds the animals of the sea, it also absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. When eventually it sinks to the ocean floor, it takes this carbon out of circulation down to a place where it remains for thousands of years. The more whales there are, the more plankton there is. The more plankton there is, the more carbon is drawn out of the air. When whales were at their historical populations, before great numbers of them were killed, it seems that they might have been responsible for removing tens of millions of tons of carbon from the atmosphere every year. Whales change the climate. The return of the great whales, if they're allowed to recover, could be seen as a benign form of geoengineering. It could undo some of the damage we've done, both to the living systems of the sea and to the atmosphere.
So I just think that does a really nice job of demonstrating so many of the roles that we don't necessarily think about with the marine mammals. So what I want to talk about today is work that we've done in waters off of Southern California. And so one of the things that people don't realize is just how many marine mammals frequent these areas. This was a minke whale that we saw one summer breaching repeatedly. We still don't know why it was breaching so often, because that's pretty unusual behavior for a minke. But we notice all of these panella attached to it, which we think maybe he was just trying to dislodge all of those. But we also see a lot of incidences of animals that are injured, such as this blue whale that has an obvious propeller injury from a ship strike. We, of course, get California gray whales, much like you do, that are migrating along our shores between Baja and the Arctic. And some of these animals show some major signs of injury. Some of you might be familiar with this particular whale. It has a couple names. It's known as both Scarback and Quasimodo, depending on who you talk to. When we observed this animal, it was interesting because at first we heard a report that there was a severely injured gray whale and people were very concerned. And when we got close, I said, oh, no, don't worry about it. I know that animal. And it's actually been seen off, I think it was first seen in Oregon in 1979. But we saw her off Dana Point in 2014, and she's lived quite a while with this extreme injury. Don't know for sure the cause, but the most likely reason is that she was probably hit by an exploding harpoon. We, of course, have a large population of pinnipeds, predominantly California sea lions, and they'll often rest on buoys. But some of these animals also show human impacts, such as this animal that has a fishing line wrapped around her neck. And unfortunately, you can see, if you look closely, that it was still wrapped around and entangled. We don't know what happened because, of course, as you probably know, it's really difficult to rescue them unless they show up injured enough that they're not going to try to escape. We have a lot of common dolphins, which we'll be talking about a little bit more. And these also often show evidence of injuries. This is probably a boat propeller based on the slashes that you can see on the body. And of course, we are lucky to sometimes see bottlenose dolphins. And people, of course, get very excited when the dolphins are nearby. And many times they just swim past the people and there's no problems. But other times you get people who get a little bit too excited and chase them down. We see that with humpback whales, which have become more and more frequently observed in our waters. And this was a case years ago where there was a humpback that was feeding very close to the shore, actually in Redondo Beach, and with very calm waters, it was surrounded constantly by people. And of course, obviously, they're not going to physically harm the animal, but that constant harassment could change their behavior and cause them to leave prime feeding grounds. So my overall research is, big umbrella topic is human impacts on marine mammals. And that can be a lot of different topics that can be related to that question. It's interesting, I just noticed that I think this is the same blue whale I've been seeing the past couple of days in Dana Point, now that I'm looking at that picture, which this picture is from quite a while ago. So I have to follow up on that. So we've been doing this work really since about 2010, but it's been since about 2012. So just over 10 years that we have consistent data. And we are trying to keep it going as a long-term monitoring, which takes a lot of time, a lot of resources. And it can be very challenging to maintain that kind of work because it's not the kind of project that brings in large grants. And so we've gotten creative in our way of being able to do this. For one thing, we used to work with Earthwatch, which I think is a great organization. Some of you may be familiar with them. we had volunteers from Earthwatch for many years who would help us collect data, and also the funds were used to be able to pay for boat time and to get the equipment we needed for our research. We developed a very close relationship with Dana Wharf Whale Watching, who've been incredibly supportive and let my students go out for free on their whale watch boats, which basically allows us to do the project, because otherwise just boat costs would make it impossible for us to do this with the limited funds that we have available. So from Data Point, we take out a variety of boats. This is one of the Dana Wharf Whale Watch boats that we go out in quite a bit, and typically we'll do a couple of trips a day. We're limited, of course, on how far we can go in that time period. So sometimes we'll go on longer trips, and sometimes we would charter boats out of Catalina. And this is the image of the boat we used in Catalina. And so we would get surveys basically within the Southern California region. And when we are out there, what we're doing is observing all marine mammals that we see. We record where it is, what it's doing, what kind of animal it is, how many, along with some environmental conditions. We also record all of the boats in the area. And we've just recently added birds to this, as a student was interested in the interaction with birds. So we have a variety of data that we are recording. Oh, sorry, that's, oops. Okay, there we go. I apologize. Okay, so who do we see when we're out there? Well, this is an image that just shows all the potential marine mammal species in the area. Obviously, we don't get all of those, but we actually see quite a few of these animals. And in fact, although I have not yet seen a sperm whale in our data, they have been seeing sperm whales in our study area for the past couple of weeks, which is quite unusual and very exciting. So which species is the most common? Well, this graph shows the 18 species that we have recorded over the years. I apologize, the x-axis is hard to read, and it's shown as the 2-letter code for the scientific name. So I don't expect you to really be able to read it, but what I wanted to emphasize is that this graph is showing the number of sightings that we have observed them. So the most commonly observed, you might notice, says ZC, or Zolophus californianus, so the California sea lion. But this doesn't show how many individuals were observed. If we redo the graph and look at number of individuals, then you'll see that the most common are the common dolphins, specifically the long-beaked commons, but the next most common are the short-beaked, and the third are the ones where we weren't sure whether they were long or short, because we didn't get a good enough view. So by far, common dolphins are the most abundant in our study area. And that's probably quite different from your region, where they're not nearly as frequently observed. You may also notice that we only have the lowest one down way over here is an Hydrolutris, or the sea otter, which we've only seen twice. So what do we do with all the data we collect? A lot of it is mapped with using GIS. And with GIS, we can learn quite a bit about the habitat use and the distribution and population status of a variety of species. So if you're not too familiar with GIS, it's a really useful mapping program where you can do dynamic maps and integrate a lot of different data. So for example, you could look at where all the sightings have been seen for a particular species or all of the animals. This is a map that's not from my own data, but I thought was useful just in that if we just looked at the sightings, which are shown in the red triangles. By the way, this is Monterey Bay. If you didn't notice, black is land. It looks kind of like a half, just a scattered mess. You can't really see any trends. But just by adding one layer, in this case, the bottom bathymetry or the terrain underwater, you might notice that the sightings are concentrated along the edges of where it goes from being shallow to deep. And that is very common for marine mammals. And we see that in our study area as well. But you can also add other layers. You could look at things like sea surface temperature. You can look at chlorophyll or fish or krill. You can look at things over time. So you can look at temporal patterns. And we'll see some examples of this as we go a little bit further. To get the data into GIS, we have changed our methodologies over the years. So originally, we used printed out data sheets, and we would record all that data I mentioned, and we had 3 different data sheets that we used for different types of data. And then we would enter it all into Excel, and we would record this all using a handheld GPS unit that we then uploaded into 2 different programs, and then we'd merge it all. And if we were successful, we would get a map in ArcGIS. This process would take many hours. I'd say for every, 2 hours on the boat, it would take about an hour of data processing. And sometimes it wouldn't work because there'd be some kind of glitch. And so about, I think it was 2016, we learned about a new app that was created by Esri called Collector, which works on, at the time we used iPads, now we've just switched to using our phones. But basically we could set up all the fields and all the same questions that we were asking, but enter it into this mobile app. And then the data just goes straight into GIS. And so it's made the whole process much more efficient, and I think has improved our ability to collect data because we're not taking quite as long in terms of recording it and processing. And so from that, we can make nice maps. So this map has way too much data, but I just want to show it as an example. This is showing all the sightings as of today. I just created this one from 2012 to now, about 5,000 sightings, meaning individual observations. But a sighting can have one or many individuals, depending on what species. So about over 265,000 animals. This is somewhat of an estimate because obviously when we see pods of common dolphins and they're in the thousands, we are not able to accurately count how many, but we come up with a rough estimate. And this map is symbolized by species. So you can see that you might remember common California sea lions were the most frequently observed, and that's the orange. So you can notice the prevalence of that color, but you also see probably a lot of blue and green, which are the common dolphins, and a fair amount of red, which are the blue whales. But we can also go in a little more depth and look at a particular species. So if we just focus on blue whales, this is the over 300 sightings of over 400 blue whales in the last just over a decade. And this time, instead of having the colors based on species, the colors are representing the different behaviors. So you might notice feeding is the most commonly observed behavior. And we can use GIS also to do more of, let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, there we go. So this is an animated map, and the time you might notice at the top is showing the day, the season. So I did it in basically 3-month periods from starting in 2012, and you'll see blue whales popping up with the little fluke marks. Notice here in 2014, all of a sudden there were a lot more. These are, of course, seasonal visitors to the area because they migrate and come to the region to feed in the summer and sometimes fall. So you'll notice they kind of pop in the summer months and then disappear in the winter and the spring. And some years we have had more than others. Notice in 2016, there weren't that many compared to 2014, but still more than you'll see in a moment. So the numbers of sightings has declined in our more recent years, which we don't really know what's happening. I don't think it's a decline in the population, but that they're feeding in other regions. So there seems to be some oceanographic differences in terms of whether or not there's enough krill in the area to support blue whales. So you'll notice for a number of years, we had very high sightings and then it got very low. This summer now, we've had a fair number of sightings. So it's looking positive, and it'll be interesting to see exactly what happens as we go further in the summer. This map only is updated through 2020, so it doesn't show the more recent data. But these are just some examples of what you can do using GIS. We can take GIS even further and do habitat modeling. And this is where we don't just look at where we have seen animals, but use that knowledge to predict where we could find them in the future. And a recent graduate from our Master's in GIS program at the University of Redlands just completed her research on habitat modeling. And what I had asked her to do was create a toolkit that could be used by undergraduate students who may not have, obviously much expertise in the field of modeling, which can get pretty complicated. And she did an amazing job looking at different models, trying to figure out what would work with our data. And the goal, of course, was to develop models that were useful and also accessible. So she used common dolphins as her study subject, since you might remember we have a lot of data on them, and they're found in the area year-round. She only used data from 1 year because otherwise it kind of overwhelms the program. And that's actually pretty common, that you kind of do 1 year at a time and then do comparisons. And she basically looked at all the sightings data, which is shown in the red dots. This is just from one season. The green lines are what we call trip logs. Basically, it keeps track of where the boat goes, so that she could then create a map that shows where the animals were observed, which is shown in the blue, compared to where we went but didn't see any common dolphins, and that's the yellow. And the goal is to look at different environmental variables and see if there's particular ones that are able to predict where you would see them that are different from the areas where we don't see them. And she looked at a variety of environmental variables, including things like the slope of the seabed, the depth, the variation, the distance from shore, etc. So this is just a few of them as examples. And then those are linked with a subset of the data of where the animals are actually observed, and do some statistics are run to see which ones are most predictive. And then you can test it using the rest of the data as comparison. So this is kind of a final map that was created. And if you look at us, she expanded the study area. So our data is only collected in kind of between the sort of where it says Laguna Niguel, San Clemente, off to Catalina, a little bit around Long Beach, but she expanded it so we could kind of predict to other areas. And the darker purple means higher probability of finding common dolphins. And the red marks are where she, red circles show data that she used to make the model. And sorry, the X's are the ones made for making the model. And then the red is the comparison. And you can see that basically where this common dolphins are seen matches quite well with where they're predicted to have a high level. But there's some that are observed in areas where we wouldn't expect them. So it's not a guarantee, but it is a useful tool in terms of helping us understand what habitat is most important and what we might want to protect. And on the left is the list of the variables that were found to be actually useful. Now, collecting this data takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. And of course, none of us are able to be out there all the time. So one of the things that I've really tried to expand is the contribution of citizen scientists, because there's a lot of people who are out on boats and would love to be able to contribute to actual research. So, this is that data sheet I mentioned earlier, which obviously we haven't used for a while. And even before we started using an app for our own data, I actually came up with the idea of having a citizen science app. And when I first came up with this idea, it was pretty novel. Now it sounds very obvious, but we basically took that information of who are we seeing, what are they doing, where are they, and when is this happening, and made an app called Whale Map. And the goal with Whale Map was to be able to make it easy for anyone who's out in the field to help record data. And the where and the when is done automatically by the app. The user just has to know what they're seeing and what they're doing. So this is just an image of what the app looks like, and it tracks where you go. And then if you were to see something, you would click the binoculars and enter in what species and what they're doing and how many, and all of that information. So this is just showing an example of that process, and even being able to upload a photo to the sightings. I worked with a graduate student at Oregon State who tested out Whale Map in Sitka, Alaska. And she did a really neat project recruiting people who were just up in the area to basically spend some time on their boats. And she created some further educational material as well, and then surveyed the users to see what they felt about the project. And what was great is she was able to recruit almost 40 volunteers who had 800 hours in one summer, which is a fair amount. And she found that the majority of people who did this were mainly interested in marine mammals in the ocean, not so much technology, but that, of course, basically was the tool. The great news was that the vast majority enjoyed using it, would recommend it, and they were learning something. They were taking this as an incentive to learn more about the animals, and hopefully then develop more of a conservation mindset. We also wanted to make sure that this data was useful, not just fun. And we were able to compare the sightings for stellar sea lions, which were mentioned earlier. And it actually, the data collected from the Whale Map users did a pretty good job of identifying known haul out sites for stellar sea lions. So those are the ones shown in blue. The ones shown in red are ones where there are haul out sites, but they weren't seen by the users. But you can notice that those are mainly in areas that had a lot less survey effort. So, it's not going to necessarily replace standardized surveys, but it can definitely supplement and add to the work that's done, especially since many times a lot of the large scale surveys are only done once every few years at one time period, whereas there are, recreational boaters and fishermen out on the water, pretty much all the time. So I really think getting more resources into the hands of the citizens can contribute to research. Another way to survey animals, especially marine mammals that are, of course, difficult to see, spend a lot of time underwater, so they're very easy to miss, is using environmental DNA. And I'm sure you're all familiar with a lot of work using DNA for solving crime or for understanding your heritage. You know, DNA is everywhere, and it doesn't have to be collected just by, getting up close to an animal and taking a sample, but skin is sloughed off into the water. And so there's DNA basically everywhere. And this idea of using environmental DNA has been used in collecting samples from snow, from soil, and of course also from seawater. And so a student who graduated last year decided she was really interested in this idea to see whether or not environmental DNA would be useful in our research. And so this was a pilot study that she did. She decided to do stellar sea lions for a couple of reasons. One, we've noticed a decline in our sightings over the years. We are not really sure what is going on with that, but it's a pretty significant decline. And this was taking into account not, just looking at sea lions observed in the water, not ones on the beaches. So we don't know if this is really a trend or if it's just there's some issue with where we're sampling. That, along with the fact that we wanted for a pilot study to make sure we were sampling areas where there were definitely going to be animals, we selected sea lions because we know where they haul out and we can collect samples from areas where there should be DNA. So we used a buoy just outside of the harbor, collected samples about 10 meters around the buoy, 3 different locations, and then about 50 meters away, also collected a sample as a control where we didn't expect there to be sea lion DNA. The results, one of the sites had no DNA from vertebrates, but it did have a lot of phytoplankton DNA. So that was kind of interesting. Site 4 was very surprising. We had cattle DNA. That went through us. We were a little confused. So I encouraged my student to look at a map, and we didn't know what we'd see, but when she looked at a map, she realized there is a farmland just on land not too far from where we do our work out of Dana Point, and there's a river just connected to that farmland. And so we assume that this was just from runoff from the farm providing cattle DNA, and her sample was collected just here, right around where that river runoff was. So I don't think there were cattle swimming, but I'm pretty sure that's where it came from. And we were a little worried. And then finally, 2 of the sites, we got the samples back, and they did show California sea lion DNA. So that was a relief to know that it does work. We can get DNA from animals that have been in the area from the water samples. So I think there's definitely potential with this. Couple problems. The biggest problem is that it's expensive. That's why we only had 4 samples. So the one thing that might reduce the cost is, instead of trying to sequence all of the DNA, which is what we were doing just to see what was there, is to do what's called single species PCR. So you're just focusing on trying to amplify the DNA of a single species. Of course, that would work if you're trying to focus on just, say, California sea lions, but as a, trying to see all of the marine mammals, then you're a little bit limited. So something that we are considering doing more in the future, but at this point, it was just kind of a pilot study to see if this has any potential. Another thing that we do a lot of is using photographic identification to assess populations of different species. In fact, we take photos to identify individuals of every single species we see, except California sea lions and common dolphins. mainly because of the abundance and the fact that both of them, they are very similar looking in terms of individuals in the population. It would be much more difficult to try and identify individuals for both of those species. And when you have common dolphin pods, often in the thousands, it'd be pretty impossible to get photographs to identify the same animal. But everyone else we do. And I wanted to talk just about work we've done with rhesus dolphins, which are great for photo ID because they have such distinctive markings. And this project was done by a student who also finished just about a year ago. She did her honors project on this. So we're using an artificial intelligence program called Flukebook. And it trains itself, and the more photos it uses, the better it gets at identifying. And we're actually often surprised by the ones where it's able to find a match, even from things that look quite different. Now, it doesn't finalize it. What it does is it uses 3 different algorithms, and it compares, in one of them, it compares the trailing edge of the dorsal fin, looking for notches and nicks. One, it looks at the whole shape of the dorsal fin, and one uses the scarring pattern. And so with the 3 together, we feel pretty confident that we're able to identify if we have the same animal seen more than once. And what it'll do is it'll give the user a ranking and tell them, you know, this is the most likely match, this is the second, and so on. But the user then has to confirm by looking at each of the options. It helps quite a bit though, because when you're dealing with thousands or tens of thousands of photos, you were trying to go through them all manually, and you have hundreds or more in the population, that can get extremely time consuming, especially for our project where we don't, you know, I have undergraduate students who work on the project for 1 to maybe a few years, but I don't have employees who are, you know the animals for a decade or more. So having a way to automate this process is really important. So some of the things that she found with rhesus dolphins was looking at, you know, their habitat use, and we see them both off of Dana Point and Catalina, although a little bit more frequently for the time spent off of Catalina. The first process is to sort the photos. There were about 2,000 photos that she worked with, and she had to go through and eliminate any that were very out of focus, or the angle was wrong, or the color contrast, and then put boxes around each photo, each fin and individual, so that the program would recognize that those were different individuals and do matches on each. And what she found was an estimate of the population somewhere between 98 and 163. Kind of depends on whether or not sometimes you only get a left or a right, and only in a few occasions do we get both sides of an individual. So if we assume that each side was a different individual, then we have, you know, a higher estimate. If we assume that they're the same individual, then we have the lower estimate. So it gives us at least an idea of how big a population is. She was also able to look at the where the pods were observed. We noticed that they tended to be in significantly deeper water off of Catalina, which we think is one of their more feeding areas, because they feed on deep sea squid. We also looked at the social structure. So there were about 10 individuals that were resighted in another pod at a different time. 2 of them were resighted 3 times, and altogether they were in 3 different pods. What you can notice is the blue are the individuals that were seen off of Catalina. The lavender was off of Dana Point. And for the most part, they're separate, but there are some that were seen in both areas. We can also look at whether they were with the same individuals or not. And 4 of them, when they were resighted, were in a completely new group. 5 of them were resighted different times, but as a group of 3 in both cases. And there was one group of 4 that was seen together in 2 different cases. So there seems to be very likely what we call a fission-fusion society with these animals, where they have some relationships, but they also move and, come in and out of the pods. And in terms of the home range, we had 6 individuals that were resighted, both in Catalina and Dana Point, and so we know they've got this minimum home size. Interestingly, the species is known to be able to have a home range of about 500 kilometers, which is essentially the distance between our study area and the Monterey Bay. So we have colleagues working in that region, and one thing we would like to do is comparison of their photo ID catalog with ours to see if there are any animals that are moving that far apart. And another project I want to tell you about is work that's been done on pollution. We know that pollution is a big risk for marine mammals. And specifically, you've probably been hearing about microplastics. So last year, I had a student who decided she took a very ambitious project to look at microplastic abundance, specifically through the trophic relationship. And she wanted to compare the amount of microplastics in plankton, fish, and California sea lions, assuming that they would bioaccumulate and increase as you moved through the food web. This was a very challenging project because she had to get permits, I think 3 different permits just to get the samples, and then also figure out how to do the all of the lab work and the analysis. But she did a really amazing project. And she collected samples from 10 sea lions where we got animals that had deceased, either found dead or died soon after joining the Pacific Marine Mammal Center. And she specifically wanted ones that were already dead or soon to, because she wanted to look at the microplastics they got from the environment, not anything that they could have picked up in the rehab center. And she looked at samples from different body parts. Then she collected sardines that were caught locally and did 2 plankton trawls. And then she had to figure out basically how to deal with the samples, how to digest them using a protease enzyme. She basically, this is showing the process of what happens. They start the dark blue, and then over time, as they break down all of the organic matter, it goes to the light color. And then the idea is that the plastics, of course, wouldn't break down with these enzymes. So this is just an image where you can see the dark spots are the microplastics. You can see they're extremely small by definition. That's from the plankton. Here's one from sardines. And here's one from sea lions. By the way, the orange is not the plastic. It's just some of the tissue that did not break down. But if we look at it graphically, you can see that there's a fair amount of microplastics in each sample. The highest were the sardines, although not statistically significantly different from the sea lions. But those are higher than the plankton, which is very similar to the blanks of the controls. So this is a very preliminary study, but it does demonstrate that, yes, it appears that there's more microplastics the higher in the food chain, and even more concerning, just how many microplastics there are pretty much in all of the living organisms. And we've also found this with further studies looking just at ocean water itself. So microplastics are definitely a concern. So the last thing I want to talk about briefly is drones. but I'm going to very quickly just turn my volume off because I don't want you to have to hear it. Let's see, give me 1 second just to turn off the sound. Okay. Hopefully the sound will not work now. Oops. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the use of drones in marine mammal research. It's actually a relatively recent invention, but it's revolutionizing the field. This is footage captured by Dana Wolf, who we work with in the field. And by using a drone and showing that aerial perspective, you can see so much more detail. You see what the animals are doing underwater, you see how they're interacting. You get a better count of how many there are. For example, we were out in the field one day and I was positive there were 25 Whistler's dolphins in a pod. Give or take a few, but I was pretty sure we were in that range. You got a drone picture, there were 50. I was way off. And the behaviors that you can see, the detail, it's just really changing our understanding of the animals. Now, the difficulty is we have a drone, but we still have to go through the process of getting permits to use the drone. And that's, if you're just, like Dana Wolf's able to use it, anybody off the street can use a drone, but because we're doing it for research, there's a whole different process to go through. So we have not yet used drones in our research, but it is something that we're working on. So these are just examples of what it looks like. And I wanted to point out, in terms of research, there's been a lot published with drones, including a paper by a colleague, Lee Torres out of Oregon State. She recently published this work looking at gray whales and how much information you could get about gray whale behavior. And what's funny is, if you read the paper, she compares her findings to the work I had published out of my PhD on grays, and basically points out how much more they were able to see and observe. And I shared this with my students, and they thought I'd be upset about it. And I was actually thrilled, because that's really the whole point of research, right? Is we want to build upon and improve and expand our understanding. So I was really excited that she'd been able to, take the work I had done and take it further using drones. So this is footage that we did take. This is from a project that we're working on with kind of just early stages of observing humpback whales in Tonga, observing their behaviors and also how they respond to swimmers in the water. And one of the things that's been really amazing is to see how when things are done correctly with proper regulations and limited, careful interactions, there doesn't seem to be obvious disturbance of the animals. This is not always the case. It depends a lot on how the boats approach, how many boats, but in the area we work in, there's not a lot of people. And I think these can really provide an amazing experience for people. And, this quote from Dr. Sylvia Earle, I think kind of illustrates how important it is to value our oceans. And I really do believe that if people are inspired to connect with marine life, they're going to be much more motivated to value them and protect them, and recognize that they're individual animals, not just a population as a whole. So I did want to acknowledge all of the many groups and people who have really helped us on this research. Especially, there's a summer research program at the University of Redlands, Dana Wharf Whale Watch, Earth Watch, some grants we have gotten through California Coastal Commission, a nonprofit that I'm involved with, Coastal Ecosystems Research Foundation, My husband, of course, Shane Keener Photography, American Cetacean Society, and obviously all of the students who've contributed greatly.
Wow, thank you, Leilani. That was fantastic. Thank you for sharing all your different ways of looking at these animals and understanding them. There's just so many ways that you pointed out. That's really amazing work that you've done, and with your students and showing their work, and beautiful, fantastic.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, no, thank you. I just absolutely want everybody to remember to support scientists and the work that they're doing, because it's so important. Let's see, August is asking, how well is the Marine Mammal Protection Act enforced? That's a good question.
To be honest, I would say not that well in terms of, well, it kind of depends. We see some really obnoxious behavior out there, and we've reported it. We never really hear what happens. You know, we've seen people try to touch sea lions, shoot them with water guns, throw things at them. And I think those kinds of things they don't really do much with. You know, if somebody's shooting them with a gun, maybe, but the kind of, you know, or they drive too fast or get too close. I don't think much is happening with that. You know, maybe people get a warning, but that's pretty much it in terms of what I've observed. I think, you know, if people do, you know, really heinous things, then they get involved. And ironically, of course, researchers have to jump through a lot more hoops to be able to do things. I found it funny how difficult it was to get samples of dead animals, you know, who'd already died naturally. And I have to get permits to do my work. Luckily, my work, because the majority of it is completely non-invasive, it's not a big process, but, you know, to get the drone permit is more so. And I noticed that one of the people asked about the drones and whether that affects whales. There's been a number of studies who've looked at that, and for most species, at least if you're high enough, it doesn't seem to disturb them, but it does seem to be species specific. So I remember like the belugas, if you approached from behind, it had a different response than if you approached from the front. Sea lions and seals definitely respond to drones if they are out of the water. So they react differently if they're on land than if they're in the water. But of course, once you get to a certain height, they don't, you know, if you're not getting really close, they can't really hear it because the noise is, you know, minimal compared to the wind and all the other sounds. Most of the studies that have found any responses when they're getting really low. So I think drones can really provide a kind of a non-invasive way to study them without really causing a disturbance.
Yeah, that's a good question. And drones can certainly be useful. I mean, some of these haul outs that are remote and hard to look at, it's great to know those numbers of, say, stellar sea lions off the Lost Coast or whatever, but
Right.
it's good to know that I mean, the documentation of all of those interactions is so important to everybody's work. But
yes,
flying over a group of stellar sea lions with a drone, they may all flush or they may not, but probably that's being gathered. So that information is being collected anyway. So that's good.
yeah, and of course, you know, is it more or less than if you have a boat coming near? Right. People on the island. And when you're trying to get counts, usually you're going to be pretty high up because you want a big perspective. I think that the only time drones really tend to get close to the animals is when they're collecting low samples. And again, in those cases, they pretty much go down, collect the sample, go up. But yes, people are definitely examining how they react to the drones.
Sure. Let's see. Misha Morandi is asking, what geographical information system application was used to map your data? Misha we're just absolutely blessed to have this intern working with the Noya Center, she's studying computer science. So
Oh,
I'm happy
excellent.
she's here. And I was like, oh, you're talking to the right person here. Excellent question. And I bet you can answer part of that.
Yes, yes. So we use Esri, so ArcGIS. We're very fortunate. It's the most commonly used program, I'd say, overall, not just marine research, but just for GIS. And one of the founders, really, of GIS software. And Esri is headquartered based in Redlands. So we are extremely fortunate. We have a lot of support and a lot of access to those resources. So I know some people will use some open source programs, but since we already get it for free, we don't have to use those other ones. Not that they're not good too, but it's nice having, technology that's supported by the commercial endeavors, means it's available for the research. So yeah, University of Redlands has a close connection with Esri, and we have a whole staff of people who have expertise in using GIS, and I talk to them frequently. They help me a lot.
Nice. Yeah, another good question. Lawrence, fantastic. I have another meeting for conservation with the CNPS NSJV North San Joaquin Valley. See you next time. Conservation can't wait. Exclamation, thank you. And Tessa says, I love hearing about the new projects your research has evolved into. What a privilege to have been a part of it. So I see some of your students are here. That's great. I believe your work in Tonga is relatively new. Awesome. How often are you hoping to do field work out there?
Yes, so we went to Tonga for the first time. Well, my husband went to Tonga. Oh God, I can't remember what year it was. A number of years ago, a few years before COVID, maybe 2015 or so. And so then we all went in 2017, I think. I can't remember. It was a few years before COVID. And we said we have to come back and do some research and take people with us to have this opportunity to swim with the whales. And that was something I was very concerned with, is I didn't want to do anything that was going to potentially harm these animals. And so before taking other people, we wanted to check it out. And I was really impressed with the area we work in, at least in Tonga. There's another area of Tonga where I've heard things are not quite as controlled. But the area that we were doing work in, there were only a few boats, one boat per animal. They never would have more than one boat, no more than 30 minutes with any animal, only 4 people in the water at a time with a guide. The guide was very careful to make sure that the distances were met, that you didn't get too close. If the whale left, that you just said, okay, no more trying to interact. So the whales, I felt like were really able to control the interaction, whether they wanted to be near you or not. But having that ability to, see them underwater and to see, they sometimes basically look at you and you're looking at them, and that connection was just amazing. So we were supposed to take a group back in 2021, which, did not happen because they didn't even open up until last summer after COVID. So we are going at the end of July for two 1-week trips. We have some people joining us. We hope to be able to do this regularly, and we're going to be, having basically the experience for people, but also recording data while we're out there, kind of a joint, sort of an Earthwatch-ish thing, but not through Earthwatch. And we were hoping to go back, the following summer, but the place we stay at is backlogged for years because of all the people who missed the trips during the years of shutdown. So we're looking at potentially doing the Cook Islands next summer, if I can make that work. So that's in process. And by the way, we have 1 spot left for this summer. If anybody wants to go at the end of July, just let me know.
Wow. Even just the cinematography that comes out of these close encounters. We just saw Patrick the Whale here at our film festival, and it was just seeing some of those interactions close and personal. brought me to tears. Just it's not something I'm ever going to be able to do, most likely, but other people getting out there and capturing those images and stories, I think, and taking the time to share them out it means a lot to us land lovers and people who aren't able to hop around. So thank you for doing that and sharing. I celebrate it.
Well, I have to give credit to my husband, because I will say, having his imagery has really, I feel like I can tell the stories much more effectively. I'm a data person. I like the numbers and the graphs and the things. But I realize that for many people, and myself included, one picture can have much more of an impact than a single graph or a whole paper of, data.
They both are so important. August again saying thank you for the information on the the Marine Mammal Protection Act. What can be done to enforce the law efficiently? Is there anything currently in the works that can make that a reality? I mean, it seems like it's just such a complicated issue with the Marine Mammal Protection Act.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just, I've seen instances of harassment and different things and some pretty blatant situations. And it was a learning experience for me just to see that if the intent is not there, but people are doing something that they don't really know, for instance, picking up a harbor seal and taking it and putting it into a bathtub or something like that, they're not going to get prosecuted. They're going to be because the intention to harm the marine mammal was not there. Obviously, there's way more blatant harassments that happen that we know about. But yet, I know, I was going to say that even if you report things, even if they don't take action on that particular instance, they may be documenting the number of harassments and taking care of, just cumulatively gathering the harassments.
But, no, I agree. I think recording things you see, so that at least NOAA is aware that people are paying attention to this. And I think educating people is really important. It's one of the things that we try to do on boats and things is, I think in many cases, I'd say the majority of cases, it's not intending to harm, like you said, it's being unaware of what is helpful, what's not. There are people who don't care, but I think that's probably less common. So I think things like, kayak companies should be providing guidance to people about how to, not get too close to animals and, not chase them and, basically educate people about what is expected and what is okay. And that I think would reduce it quite a bit. And I think there were incidents, you might have remembered, there was the humpback whale that breached onto the kayak in Monterey Bay. And after that, all of a sudden the kayak company was like, maybe we should adjust the way we're approaching these animals. And, because it can be a risk for the people as well, not just the marine life.
True. Yeah, well, any other questions? If anyone wants to unmute and ask a question, that's a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And I always love talking about the animals and the work we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. The last one, tags and brands. I know that we see a lot of tagged and branded animals and reporting them up. I'm lucky to be able to report them through California Academy of Sciences and on up to the different scientists that are doing the work. Not necessarily satellite tags, but brands of animals like the stellar sea lions that are branded, gathering information on them and their movements, or the green tagged California sea lions, and reporting those. So I think that you've given us a few tools that are helpful in terms of documenting different sightings and the whale map app. And
I should point out, whale map is on a bit of a hiatus at the moment. We unfortunately, the when we first developed it, using different software and whatnot, and apps have changed over the years. And so we reconfigured it to work on new software, and then resubmitted to, to Apple and to Google Play Store and all of that. Finally got it working again, but some of the features aren't functioning right. So that's one of the projects I need a student to take on. A lot of times we have all these different projects we're working on, so I'm always trying to find students. I'm hoping to get a master's in GIS student really to work on it, or somebody with computer science expertise, who can help get that functioning again, because I know there's other apps that have developed as well, but one of the things that I really like about Whale Map is that the goal is that it's freely available data and data that can be collected worldwide. So when it's functioning, there's a map that people can just go into and they can see the data, they can contribute to it, they can use it for projects if they want. We've had some students do that. But like I said, right now it's a little bit down on the button, unfortunately. So somebody asked if there's any place online to follow it. That's actually something we're working on. I have a student who's working with me this summer, and we want to develop a website and a story map to be able to kind of keep updates more of what we're doing. Because yeah, right now it's kind of like all in-house and not really on the public end.
So not really anywhere where we can follow your work if we.
Yeah, I mean, I have a University of Redlands site that, sort of the standard boilerplate stuff. So once I get that updated, or once I get the website that we're working on, I will put it in there. And I can try to remember to send it to you if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That's a summer project. So
Yeah.
hopefully not too long.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, good. Thank you. Insightful, wonderful work. Give my best to Shane and Zoe. You've got some fans in the audience for sure. And Sarah says, this is amazing. Thank you so much. Is there any scientific research in Northern Californians could be adding or expanding to all of this data that you've been collecting, a collaboration of sorts? So I don't know, stellar sea lions or the collaborative. I think that the Rizzo's dolphins piqued my interest because of their range and we're seeing, and I was like, anyway. So that's a good question, Sarah, in terms of connecting Southern California bite to what we're seeing up here.
Yes, yeah, and I would. That's something I really would like to be able to do more, is figure out ways to streamline collaboration. So right now it tends to happen sort of, oh, I know this person's studying this, and we talk and share, but it's not super easy to do, especially because data is collected in different ways, and just managing it all. I mean, I have to admit, just managing my database kind of gets a little overwhelming. But I love collaborating, and I do think it's really important. So if anyone's interested, definitely reach out to me. And like I said, once we get Whale Map functional, that's a nice way to be able to record sightings from anywhere. And it's super easy because it's just on a phone. You don't have to have special equipment or anything.
Awesome.
And I do have some collaborators down here, for example, some naturalists on the whale watch boats who take photographs, and they send me their photos. And then the idea is we can, start comparing our photos to theirs. At this point, we haven't quite finished our own data photos, so we haven't added those in, but we have them all organized and hope to start doing that soon.
Nice. Do you submit to Happy Whale or work with Happy Whale at all? Because I think we're familiar with Happy Whale up here, quite a few members that submit.
In fact, I had met Ted years ago when I presented on Whale Map before he had developed Happy Whale, and he was talking about it. So it's been great to see how successful that's been. We mainly just submit the humpbacks for Happy Whale, although I know he's trying to expand to other species as well.
Yeah. Great. And we have in the audience Scott and Tree Mercer, who we look at Dana Point as the gray whales do their migration. And then we have Scott and Tree Mercer here who are at Point Arena, and they count the gray whale migration and have been doing so. This is their 10th year. And they are very helpful in letting the California Academy of Sciences folks know when it comes to the gray whales and their movement. And you know, what are we looking at? Are we still going to be responding to deceased gray whales? And, you know, so this collaborative stuff, it does exist. And I
Yes.
think we continue to build off that as we get to know each other in this coastal community that stretches from where you are up to where we are and further and beyond. These animals that migrate past us all, they're you know, connecting us all. So
Right. Yes, and I have communicated with Scott and Tree a number of times, and love to get up and see that work too.
yeah.
I head up to the Monterey Bay area relatively frequently. My sister lives in Carmel, and of course, we love to get out in the water up there. And now the University of Redlands has we have a Marin campus.
Oh,
So I haven't made it to the campus yet, but that would be something that would be great, because I don't think it's too far from that work. Probably
no,
not too far from you guys either, right?
no, that's very close.
Yeah.
Cool. Wonderful. All right. Well, any other questions? Thank you, everybody, for being with us again on a great science talk. Wow.